Yes, Chandima, we can hear you. Good morning.
Thank you. And thank you very much for all of you participate in today's three days the virtual national workshop on trade-in services, liberalization and options for developing countries, jointly organized by the World Trade Organization, the Permanent Mission of Sri Lanka to the World Trade Organization and the Department of Commerce. I thank you, Ms. Rosie Sang from the WTO and Madam Gautami Silva, permanent ambassador and permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the World Trade Organization, who is joining today's session. And I would like to cordially invite to Madam Gautami Silva to deliver her opening remarks. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everyone from Geneva. Good afternoon to all participants joining from Sri Lanka. And Mrs. Rosie Zhang, our resource personnel from the World Trade Organization. I hope our DG, Director General of Commerce, will be joining very soon. So, dear fellow, my colleagues, of course, from the Department of Commerce, as well as all the participants who have joined today. It gives me a great pleasure in sharing a few of my opening remarks before we actually get into the technical sessions. First, I would like to thank the World Trade Organization, particularly the colleagues, our colleagues at the Services Division and the Technical Cooperation Division, Madam Chechila, for agreeing, first, of course, accommodating our request, and second, agreeing to conduct this valuable workshop over a period of three days. I know Sri Lanka had been a founding member, and as you know, and also we are a founding member of the World Trade Organization as well. And so when we joined the WTO in 1995, Sri Lanka, being a small economy, made substantial commitments in the area of trading services. The agreement, particularly a general agreement in trading services, is a flexible agreement where a lot of opportunities are made available for developing countries like us, small developing countries like us, to make commitments in commensurate with its level of development. Accordingly, Sri Lanka undertook certain commitments, limited in nature, while safeguarding its national interest. I think under the specific commitments, we have made quite user-friendly commitments in areas of telecommunication, financial services, tourism, and investment. I think those commitments, though appear to be quite moderate in substantial amounts, we also were a beneficiary of the commitments made by other WTO members, because normally the concessions are extended on MFN basis, whatever they have extended on MFN basis. So Sri Lanka also had been a beneficiary of the commitments that the other WTO members made. Over the years, Sri Lanka had been also negotiating free trade agreements with the bilateral partners, and then even in the regional context. So far, except in bilateral agreement with Singapore, we have not made specific commitments or even sectoral commitments with any other bilateral partner. But I think Sri Lanka is contemplating to make such commitments in commensurate with its level of development. Therefore, this seminar is going to be quite useful and beneficial to our negotiators, as well as the participants who have joined today. That would give them a lot of background. I tend to agree with many speakers. I think even in the WTO context, the the GATS per se appears to be quite complex, but if you really dig into the substance, it's not the case. In Sri Lanka, we don't have many experts who have specialized in GATS, only very few. So this seminar, I think, which will be conducted over a period of 3 years, are going to be quietly, immensely beneficial to all the participants, and including my colleagues at the Department of Commerce, as well as the negotiators who will be negotiating at bilateral level and regional level of certain sectors covering GATS in those future FTAs, free trade agreements. So therefore, without much further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Director General of Commerce, who had joined now, and then through the Department of Commerce and my permanent mission, we would like to thank WTO Secretariat for agreeing to the agenda. I think as the agenda was carefully crafted and agreed, and the WTO agreed to accept many of the suggested topics that we thought it would be useful for the participants. So they were quite flexible in accommodating all our requests. And so I would like to thank WTO for that, and also for providing us this technical assistance. I think there can be many more such requests, workshops that we can certainly coordinate and conduct with the assistance of WTO. So I wish all the participants good luck, and please follow the course because I think there will be also exercises given by the WTO speakers, the resource personnel. Please study, attend to and work with the officials with view to enhancing your knowledge, because this is a very complex but very user-friendly agreement if you can master the technical details of this agreement. So with that, I wish all the participants a great success. And Mr. Kodikara, you have the floor, and I was offered to speak because of your engagement with the minister. So now I think you have the floor, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gautami. Good morning and good afternoon. Depends on where are you. So Ms. Gautami Silva, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Sri Lanka to the World Trade Organization, WTO. Mrs. Rosie San, Counselor, distinguished speakers and representatives of the WTO and the participants from Sri Lanka. While apologizing for the bit delay to join this important forum, it's my pleasure to join today's workshop on services organized by the Department of Commerce in collaboration with the permanent mission of Sri Lanka to the WTO and with the technical assistance of the WTO. As I learned, this workshop is timely important for the government of Sri Lanka because we are in the process of reviewing the free trade agreements, and with number of countries, we have given high priority by the government of Sri Lanka, especially including China, India, and Thailand. In this development, trade in services is bound to play a pivotal role in those agreements aligned with the government policy of integrating Sri Lanka with global economy and partner countries in line with the accepted disciplines and rules. In this context, to empower all stakeholders, both in public and private sectors, on the concept, disciplines, and rules of trade in services between and among nations are imperative at this juncture. It is my sincere expectation that this workshop will provide an in-depth understanding to the participants of the legal framework of the General Agreement on Trade in Services known as GATS under WTO, concepts and discipline of trade in services, service-related aspects of e-commerce and service data, state of play of the services negotiations at various levels, bilateral, regional, plurilateral, and multilateral, etc., and negotiations on domestic regulations. It will immensely support the members of the negotiation team of the services chapter of the above agreements to enhance their understanding on service sector, which will support in gaining benefits for Sri Lanka during the negotiations. Last but not least, I wish to express my sincere gratitude to the staff of the WTO Secretariat for their support and commitment in organizing this very important event within a very short time, and look forward your support and cooperation in our future projects as well. Further, my appreciation goes to the team of the Permanent Mission of Sri Lanka, to the WTO in Geneva, and the Department of Commerce for their hard work towards organizing this virtual event successfully. I wish all the participants the success of 3 days 7. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon in Colombo. My name is Rosie Zhang. I'm Counselor of Trading Services and Investment Division. It's my pleasure to talk about trading services with you. And first, I want to thank Miss Ambassador Siva for your introduction. And also, I want to thank Mr. Kodikara for your also insightful introduction. I will talk about trading services in the following 2.5 hours. So my introduction will be very brief. I want to make probably 3 points. The first point is about the importance of services and the service trade in economy. I think today no one would question the importance of services and service trade in economy, in global trade, especially today. Economies are interconnected, especially through global value chains, and it becomes highly important for any economy to get integrated in global value chains, and services and services trade. They are the clue to connect the value chains. And so it's it becomes even more important for economies, especially an economy like Sri Lanka as an island and small economy, to get integrated and connected to global value chains, global trade. And this we will discuss further during my presentation. And secondly, I want to talk about it's important to have the certainty and the predictability of business environment. For businesses, it's crucial to have certainty and the predictability. And this is why we need rules. We need trade agreements. We need multilateral trade agreements like the GATS, which provides certainty and predictability to international trade in services. Okay, so this is why we need to understand the rules of the GATS, and then that will help the governments make more reasonable and business-friendly policies and rules. And the third point, I want to highlight the importance for governments to negotiate trade agreements. Why government needs, why they negotiate trade agreements? Because they want to get more market access or business opportunities through trade agreements. They want to attract foreign investment. They want to make their regulatory environment more business friendly. Okay, and like Miss Ambassador already just mentioned that each economy can benefit from a secure and a predictable business environment provided by trade agreements. So I think that's the 3 points I want to make. I am going to stop here, and we will finish the. I don't know whether Miss Ambassador Silva and Mr. Cordera, you want to say something else? Otherwise, I think we can conclude the opening session, and then we move to the first session of this workshop.
Yes, Ms. Rosie, I do not wish to say because we are have to stick into the timetable. We are slightly behind the timetable, so certainly the flow is now yours, and please proceed with the program that is lined up for the day. Yeah, thank you. You can certainly continue with your speakers.
Thank you. I'm going to present my slides. First, I want to apologize to participants. Normally, we prefer very interactive presentations to have really insightful exchange with participants. But I think the virtual event, creates some inconvenience. But still, I want to encourage participants to engage actively. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and then I will stop and call you to speak. Okay, now let me...
Rosie, they can also use the chat box.
Yes.
Okay,
please also use the chat box to have your questions, and then I can pick them up at the end of my presentation. Okay. Now, please let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? I hope you can.
Yes, Rosie, we can see it.
Okay. Now, my presentation is a very basic one, and then in the program you have. I'm sorry. Let me. Okay. In the program you have seen a lot of bullet points. Yeah. So we have probably 2 hours now. Let's see. How much we can cover. This is first I want to show you, this is the outline of my presentation. I already mentioned the role of services and the service trade in economy, but I'm going to give you some numbers, okay, so that you will have a clearer picture about that. And then what I'm going to talk about, what are the main trade problems in services, and how does the GATT seek to address these problems. So I'm going to cover the structure, definitions, logic of obligations of the GATT. And then that's the core of the GATT is schedule of specific commitments. And last, I'm going to walk you through the GATT commitments undertaken by Sri Lanka, provide you an overview. And I am sure on that we can have a good discussion. Okay. I already mentioned the importance of services and the service trade. Now let's look at some numbers. If you look at the share of services in GDP, okay, 2020, you will see that I think across the board, the world economy has become a services-driven economy. If you look at the average of world GDP, nearly 70% of the share of world GDP, it's services. And then this is even higher for high-income countries. Middle-income countries, I think it's nearly 60%. Low-income countries, more than 40%. But if you look at individual countries, for example, United States, almost 80%, European Union, more than 70%. And then if you look at some, and then Japan, also 70%, and some large developing economies like India, China, Indonesia, Brazil. Brazil, very high. China we all know that is a world factory. manufacturing is important. But if you look at China, China is also becoming more and more services driven, and the services now account for 56% of the GDP. The last, I think, is 2021. The studies have shown that the competitiveness of China's manufacturing, I think that's services contribute to that. So thanks to services and services trade, okay, China's manufacturing has increased its efficiency and also its competitiveness, okay. And if you look at Sri Lanka is a middle income country, which with services accounting for 60% of GDP, okay. So that's Sri Lanka. If you look at the trade in services, depends on the statistical methodology. If we based on balance of payment, that methodology, this services trade has been growing much faster than trading goods since 2005. Okay, and if you look at the services trade account for 21%, and now because of COVID, okay, 2020 slowed down, but then it picked up 2021, so now it's 21%. Okay, and the highest is 2019, reached 25% of global trade. Okay, this is based on GDP. And I just mentioned trading commercial services was affected by COVID hugely. And then if you look at especially in 2020, especially travel has been affected, reduced more than 60%. And then again, transport and goods related services, total commercial services, they all reduced a lot during 2020. Okay, and the same happened to Sri Lanka. If you look at the impact of COVID on service trade in Sri Lanka, we have seen that Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka tourism, I think represents an important part of Sri Lanka's economy, and then because of the COVID, the restrictions on travel, and also the impact on transport. Okay, the COVID-19 pandemic has damaged hugely Sri Lanka's services trade. If you look at even is even higher than the average of global impact. Okay, and this is the transport. What happened to Sri Lanka during the COVID pandemic? This is to look at the regional breakdown of trading commercial services, and you see that developed countries, rest of Europe, intra-Europe, okay, and North America represent big share of global trade in services. Asia is picking up 26%, okay, and Africa is very small, is 2%, Middle East 5%, and the Central South America and Caribbean 2%. Okay. Let's look at the leading services exporters. The top 10 is very concentrated trading services. Top 10 services exporters represent nearly 80% of world services exports. Okay, and if you look at some other country, developing countries, here are some numbers. And where is Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka, the share in world total service exports in 2021 is 0.04%. The value is 2.4 billion. And if you look at the ranking, Sri Lanka ranks 74 in the world. Okay, so this is if we look at services export. I just mentioned that talking about the importance of services trade. I'm going to talk about the transactions of service trade, but here I just want to mention that very briefly. Services trade is defined as a supply of services through 4 modes of supply. And I'm going to talk about that in detail, but I'm sure most of you probably have heard of these jargons. And mode 3 basically refers to foreign investment. So services can be supplied through foreign investment. So like, foreign invested subsidiaries, branches, okay, through the foreign affiliates to supply services to local consumers. That's mode 3, okay? If we, just now I show you the balance of payment, that is only consider the services trade between residents and non-residents. But if we consider services trade, including mode 3, that means that if we include services supplied through foreign affiliates, and then you will see that the share of services trade in global trade is much higher, is nearly 45%. Okay, so this is just to show to highlight the importance of services trade. Let's look at services trade by sector. Okay, if you look at the different sectors, you will find that distribution and financial services are the most traded services sectors. Okay, so nearly 20% distribution services. Okay, more than 18% are financial services, and followed by telecommunication, computer, and audiovisual services, 13%, and transport, 11%. Okay, tourism, 7.8%. Okay, so this is, if you look at the sectors, importance of services trade. And then the modes of supply. Okay, I already mentioned that the services can be traded through 4 modes. Okay, mode 1, that's cross-border. So from services supplied from the territory of one country to the territory of another country, that's, we call it cross-border. Cross-border now represents more than 27% already. If you look at the data, I think 1 decade or 2 decades ago, the number of mode, the number of for mode 1 was much smaller. It has increased very fast because of digital technology. Digital technology facilitates cross-border trade, and which make a lot of services tradable. So you have now, you see that mode 1 is more than 27%. Okay, mode 2, consumption abroad. So consumers, okay, they travel to another country to consume services like tourism. Okay, and also you have students, they study abroad, and also have patients, they travel to another country to have health services, and also you have ships, aircraft repaired in another country. These are all considered as mode 2. And consumption abroad. Consumption abroad, mode 2 represents 10%. The most important mode, of course, is mode 3. I just mentioned that services supplied through foreign investment. Now it accounts nearly 60%. And mode 4, that services supplied through the presence of natural person. That means that through the movement of natural person, that is still the smallest mode. It's 22.3%. Okay, and the reason why mode 4, the share of mode 4 is very small compared to other modes. I think I'm going to talk about that later, but because most countries are very sensitive about the foreign workers coming work in their countries, and then so it's related to each country's immigration policy, labor policy, and then so most countries they are reluctant to open their market to the movement of natural persons as a mode of supply for services trade. So I'm going to talk about that later, but just to show you the importance of different modes. And of course, you know that for the different countries, the different modes, the importance of different modes may vary. So we are going to talk about that later. And if you look at the professional and other business services, the share of export by mode of supply, and then in selected groups of economies, and then if you look at the 5 the leading developing economies and developed economies and other developing economies, you will see that, okay, for both, I think for the developed economy and the 5 leading economy, mode 3 is the most important, okay, and for some, and then you have mode 1 economy. That's mode 1, the most important for other developing economy, and then for also for other developing economy, you will see that this is mode 4. The importance has shown the importance for other developing economy compared to leading developing economy and developed economy. So if you look at digital services trade, some numbers, according to WTO estimates, global exports of digitally delivered services have more than tripled since 2005. That registered an average annual growth rate between 2005 and 2019 at 7.3%. Far more than the 5.6% rate for other services exports, okay? And for trading goods, during that period, the average growth rate for trading goods is 4.7%. So just to show you that from 2005 to 2019, okay, digital services or digitally delivered services have seen the fastest growth compared to other services and also compared to trading goods. So this is, I think, it's probably the most important trends in services trade or in global trade. Okay. How about the services as an input to products traded? Okay, so we talk about the importance of services trade, but then if we look at imports, services as imports, as inputs to products, okay, if you look at the global the structure of world exports in goods terms, 2018, okay, and then you will see that, okay, this let me show the next slide. Okay, services as a value-added input to manufacturing industry. This is in manufacturing, And then if you look at the different colors and the numbers, they represent the share of the inputs of services in different products, okay? And then if you look at manufacturing, wholesale and retail represents 10% inputs in the manufacturing industry. And then other business represent 7.2%. And then if you look at financial services, insurance services, that's 3.2%. And then if you look at electricity, gas, water supply, real estate, construction, and public health, education, accommodation, food services, you will see all the different, the share of different service sectors as inputs to manufacturing. So you see that the services, okay, they create the most value added to manufacturing products. Okay, that creates a term, we call it servicification. Okay, non-service firms, they buy and produce, okay, more and more services. If you look at just the bread, okay, and then we just to produce a lot of bread, and 30 services are required, accounting for 72% of the final price. And this is if you look at the Rolls-Royce, the engine, to produce the engine, okay, 15 types of services, they are important inputs to the engine. And then, for example, from research and development, R&D services, to maintenance and to maintenance of delivered products, okay. And of course, this is just to show you another example of, we call it servicification, okay, importance of services in manufactured products. So this is the introduction about the importance of services and the services trade, okay. In total, services generate 52% of the civil aircraft revenue from after-sale services, okay? So I'm going to stop here about the role of services and the services trade. Before I move to the next section about the GATS, may I ask, do you have any questions? Okay, seem is not the case. Now let's move to my next section about the GATS. Talk about the GATS. I think first I need to explain a little bit the rationale behind the GATS. Okay, I already mentioned that why countries negotiate trade agreements. Of course, countries, they want to benefit from trade agreements because they believe that trade agreements can create better trading opportunities by opening new markets for goods and services, increasing investment opportunities, and make trade cheaper by reducing custom duties and cutting red tapes, making trade faster by facilitating transit through customs, setting common rules on technical standards. And also, of course, they want to make policy environment more stable, more predictable, and more business friendly, okay? So this is why governments, they negotiate trade agreement. But what are the main problems in services trade, okay? Compared to trading goods, okay? Trading in services, if a government wants to protect its own economy, they cannot impose tariffs. Okay, so services trade, what services trade is facing is restrictions on the entry of services, entry investment and the people, and there are restrictions on the establishment. And then all these restrictions, they are in the form of regulation, okay? And also, of course, there are restrictions on the ongoing services operations. And for foreign services suppliers, they are facing discriminatory treatment, okay? And there are also non-transparent laws and regulations, rules, procedures, which also affect services suppliers. And of course, there are also other regulations. They are needed to protect the consumer, for example, to ensure services, service suppliers, they have the qualification to supply service, but these regulations, they may be unnecessarily burdensome. And also, there are also some regulations, they are anti-competition, okay? And then so these are the problems in services trade. So in order to facilitate a services trade, we need to address these problems. This is why, okay, the governments, when they negotiate trade agreement to govern services trade, they need to address these problems to facilitate service trade. But on the other hand, they are also facing challenges when draft services rules. I just mentioned that the nature of services trade is different from trading goods. Trading goods are tangible, visible. Goods need, import, export goods. You need to cross the border, and then you can impose tariffs, and then you can implement custom procedures, and then you can check and verify the goods when they cross border. Okay, all these measures you cannot implement in services trade because services are intangible, invisible, and also the supply of services and the consumption of services, usually they take place at the same time. You need the physical contact between services producer and the service consumer, for example, restaurant, hotel services, okay? So the question is raised, how we can adapt, trade rules to the nature and the characteristics of trading services. This is one challenge. Second challenge is that I already mentioned that services and the services trade, they are sort of regulation intensive. Okay, even the trade barriers, they are in the form of regulation. Okay, and so each government is facing a challenge. On the one hand, they may want to eliminate trade barriers, but on the other hand, they still want to have regulatory autonomy because there are also a lot of needs to regulate services trade for various policy objectives. You need to protect, for example, consumer, protect public order, and then public moral, and then you may also need to ensure, and also security for security reasons, and also you basically you need to ensure that service suppliers, they have the qualification to supply service. For example, if to open a restaurant, you need a license, okay, to prove, to make sure that restaurant or open a hotel, the operator, they have the financial capacity, they have the managerial skills, they meet the technical or health standards. Okay, so all these requirements, they are in the form of regulation. So the government has to balance between trade liberalization and the regulatory autonomy. So if to give, this is the important role of regulation in services. And then another challenge is to manage the diversity in services, because different sectors, they have different nature and characteristics. Financial services are very different from hotel and restaurant services. And in financial services, regulations, of course, are completely different from the regulations in health services. And also countries, they are also different in terms of the level of development. I just mentioned that developed economies, they are much more advanced in services, especially in sectors like financial services, telecommunications, and also this is this means that different countries, they have different priority when they want to pursue services and services trade. And also services transactions are different. I already mentioned the 4 modes of supply, okay? And mode 1 is different from mode 3 and mode 4, okay? This also means that different economies, they also have different priorities when they pursue different modes of supply. For example, developing countries, they are probably they are willing to attract foreign investment, so they are willing to make commitments on mode 3, but they are not willing to open markets on the mode 1, because on the mode 1, it's very difficult to implement your regulation. But developing economies, they have advantage in mode 4, so they want to pursue mode 4 exports. So this is, just to show you that services are services trade very diverse. So, and then this is also a challenge for negotiation. Because of all this challenge, the first agreement on trading services, or the first multilateral agreement on trading services, and general agreement on trading services, the GATS, okay, was negotiated from 1986 to 1994 during the Uruguay round. And this agreement is really a very modest agreement if you look at the level of liberalization, okay? And then because it's intended to provide disciplines, multilateral disciplines, to progressively reduce obstacles to services trade, taking into account the nature of services trade and also the complexity of services trade. And then so the principle, the core principle of the GATS is progressive liberalization, okay? It allows countries to gradually reduce trade barriers on individual country basis through successive rounds of negotiation. So flexibility is an important feature of the GATS. Okay? And so what we have under the GATS is a common set of disciplines for all members. So it's a framework agreement. And then with annexes, the annexes contain special rules for some sectors and modes of supply. First, for example, we have an annex on telecommunication, annex on financial services, and then it was intended to have an annex on maritime transport, providing special rules, but the negotiation on maritime transport were not concluded. So the annex actually only provides for the mandates for continuous negotiation. Okay, and then we have an annex on mode 4. Okay, and then the GATS provides a creative definition of trading services that's through 4 modes of supply. That's trading services, which allows for differentiated commitments on individual country basis. Okay, so each country has its own schedule of specific commitments. Okay, which covers market access, national treatment, and additional commitments. This is what we are going to explain in detail later. Okay. So this is just to a picture to show the GATS architecture. You have the framework agreement, which has 29 articles. It's not a long agreement. And then with some annexes, this is a uniform element for all WTO members. Then I mentioned that we have another part of the agreement is member-specific elements. Each member has a schedule of specific commitments. And also, most WTO members, they have a list of MFA exemption. And then, so this I'm going to explain later. Okay, why in services, members are allowed to make some reservations to the general agreement, most favored nation treatment, why they are allowed to make reservations. We call it MFA exemption. Okay. So this is to show you that the agreement has 6 parts. Part 1 is about the scope of application and definition. Part 2 contains general obligations and disciplines. And part 3, specific commitments. And part 4 lays down the mandate for future negotiations. And part 5 is about the institution arrangements, provision, and then part 6 is final provisions. Okay. The scope of application of the GATS. Okay. The first provision of the agreement sets out the scope of application. The agreement applies to measures by members affecting trading services. If you are familiar, the agreements in trading goods, for example, the GATT, it has no such an agreement. But the GATT has no such a provision. But the GATT has such a provision as we call it a threshold provision. It's very important. When we look at a government, a law, regulation, administrative decision, or government action in action, whether it is covered by the GATT or not, we have to look at it to examine, to consider it, whether it falls under the scope of the GATT. We look at whether that is a measure affecting trading services. When we say affecting trading services, it means that if a measure has an impact, has an effect on the supply of services through the 4 modes of supply. Okay, and then there are a lot of government actions, inactions, measures. They are not within the scope of the GATS. Okay, and the GATS only applies to measures affecting trading services. And when we say measures, we say government action in actions at any level, in federal level, central government level, provincial, local government level, but not private actions. And the services, all services are covered except governmental services. Governmental services are services supplied under the government authority, and then in the exercise of government authority. And then when we say in the exercise government authority, means that the services are supplied not on a commercial basis or in competition. For example, services like judicial services, like police, like fire protection. You know, these services are supplied by the government as a government authority, okay? And then, so the question is often raised is, if like education, health, they are supplied by the government, and they are public health, public education, whether they are also covered under the GATS. That question is very tricky, because when we talk about whether the services whether a service is covered or not, we look at, you know, whether it's in the exercise of government authority, and then the definition of in the exercise of government authority means that not on commercial basis and not in competition. So the question is often very tricky, because in many countries, public health and the private health, they are coexist. They are in coexistence, and in some cases, they are in competition. The same for education. You have private university and public universities, and they are in competition. So the question is raised, can we still argue that public education or public health, they are excluded from the GATS? The question is, I think, is still open. I think in order to make the case, we need to, you know, to study it on the case-by-case basis. We need to look at the evidence, okay, whether it's on commercial basis or whether it's in competition. And then air traffic rights. This is that is a major part of air transport services. They are also excluded from the GATS. The reason for that is because air transport, international air transport regime is based on bilateral agreements, okay? So the government, economies or countries, they supply air transport services based on bilateral agreements. So bilateral agreements provide mutual air traffic rights, okay, to the parties. And then this kind of reciprocal, this kind of sort of reciprocity is inconsistent with MFN. So this is why air transport, the major part of air transport services, this air traffic rights related services, they are excluded from the GATS. Okay. Trading services, I already mentioned, they are supplied through 4 modes of supply. Okay, I will not repeat here. So now let's look at the scope coverage of the GATS. You have services not covered by the GATS, governmental services, services linked to air traffic rights, and then you have services covered by the GATS. And then we have services included in the schedules. This I will explain to you in detail, okay? Only part of the services included in the schedules. And obligations, some obligations, we call them general obligations, they apply to all services. And then, but we have obligations, they apply only to services listed in schedules. So you see, this is the coverage of the GATS. It sounds a little bit complicated, but when I explain the schedules to you, and you will see that it's not so complicated, just to show you that the sectoral coverage of the GATS has different layers. Okay, you see, you have the different layers. This is to illustrate modes of supply health services. Now, we can supply health services through mode 1, like tele diagnostic from country A to country B. you send your file to another country and doctor provides diagnostic and then send you back through email, for example. And this is mode 1. And the patients resident in country B receive treatment in another country, that's consumption abroad, mode 2. And the hotel services, hospital from country A opens a branch or joint venture in country B. And doctor from country A perform a surgery in country B. And so this is mode 4. Let's look at in financial services, again, 4 modes of supply. International payment services over internet, that's mode 1, cross-border supply. And then the banking services, so you have banking services, you travel to another country, and then you have your banking services in another country, that's mode 2. And foreign banks set up branches in host country, mode 3, commercial presence, and mode 4, the bank's financial consultants working in another country, mode 4. Okay. So now I move to another area to talk about the obligations and the commitments under the GATS. This part is a little bit dry, I'm afraid. But I think what I'm going to do is that I'm not going to talk about the details of the obligations. And I will just give you an overview. And if you have questions later, I can answer your questions. In the interest of time, because I have to cover a lot of points in this presentation. So what I want to first highlight, it's very important, is that there are 2 types of obligations under the GATS. One is called obligations, general obligations. Another is called specific commitments. But the legal nature of these 2 types of obligations is the same, but we use different terms to make a distinction because there's logic behind it. General obligations contained in part 2 of the agreement, they are the same for all the WTO members. So that's general obligations, okay? And then some general obligations, they are applicable to measures affecting all sectors, like MFN, like some transparency. And then we have some obligations. They are still general because they apply to all WTO members, but they apply only to measures, okay, in scheduled sectors. Okay, so like notification, like some domestic regulation related obligations, like in some annex on telecommunication, for example. But the second type of obligation is not sort of general. Why is not general? Because it's member specific. So it's the specific obligation, okay, the specific bindings, you have to find that in country specific schedules. So these are commitments on market access, on national treatment, and additional commitments. So these are part 3, Article 16 and 18. Okay, so this is the logic. Why there's a logic? Why we make that distinction? It's because I already mentioned at the very beginning, the nature of trading services. We don't have tariffs, and then so in trading goods, there's a distinction between trade barriers and regulation. Governments, they need regulatory autonomy to regulate their services, okay? And but at the same time, there are also certain sort of, we call them barriers. They are not sort of rational, they are not needed for trade, but so we need to make a distinction, okay? And then so this is why member states need to eliminate their trade barriers. And then so the trade barriers are normally considered as a quantitative restrictions, discriminatory restrictions. And these restrictions will be eliminated gradually. And the way to eliminate these trade barriers is through we call it scheduling, through commitments. So this is the logic. Let's look at some general obligations, and then I will move into the scheduling. Most favored nation treatment, MFN. This is a sort of cornerstone of multilateral trading system. It's very simple. It's just to make sure that all the members are treated equally. So you will not discriminate across members. And then so each member shall accord to services and service suppliers of any other member treatment no less favorable than it accords to like services and services suppliers of any other country. And then so the purpose of this kind of obligation, this kind of requirement is to ensure that equal competitive opportunities for all the trading partners, okay? But under the GATS, there are some departures are permitted. I already mentioned that members are allowed to make MFN reservation, that they list their reservation in the MFN exemption list. And then members, they can negotiate regional trade agreements, economic integration under Article 5. And this is also inconsistent with MFN, but they are allowed in both trading goods and in trading services. And because we think that regional trade agreements or FTAs, they are pursuing the same objective as the GATT or the GATT. So we think they are building blocks to multilateral trading system. And then in services, governments, they are allowed to make mutual recognition agreements or arrangements. So for example, two countries mutually recognize each other's professional qualification or certificates or license, and then but then this mutual recognition is not extended to other countries. And then this kind of mutual recognition normally exists between the countries. They share common culture, common legal system, common historical background. For example, Australia and the United States, for example, your engineer qualification obtained in Australia is recognized in the United States, and then the same your qualification obtained in United States is recognized in Australia. And now, of course, there are general exceptions and also security exceptions. They can be, extend. And then these are the measures pursuing non-trade objectives, but they are considered even more important than trade, like public health, public moral, and also in financial services, there are also measures. They are taken to sort of try to ensure financial security, and they are taken for prudential purposes. And then in financial services, these measures can also be inconsistent with MFN. Okay. In maritime sector, because the negotiation is not concluded, and then so members are still allowed to maintain, sorry, MFN, you know, this is MFN is the application of MFN is suspended to uncommitted maritime transport services. Why members are allowed to make reservations to MFN? Because in services before the GATS, already many governments, they have concluded sectoral agreements, for example, in road transport, in rail transport, and you know, and in financial services, in audiovisual services. These agreements, they cover only one sector, okay, but they cannot be justified under the provision on regional trade agreements, okay. And then also, you also have some national laws require reciprocal treatment. And then the government, they don't want to change their regulation, okay. And also, you also have some regional and other economic agreements, like the bilateral sectoral agreements. They do not satisfy the criteria of Article 5. They do not cover all sectors. They cover only a single mode of supply, and then they do not aim at full liberalization within the group. So because of all these reasons, members, they need flexibility to make reservation to MFN, to the general obligation. And then so members are allowed to list their MFN exemptions, but members has only one chance to make that reservation. So for original members like Sri Lanka, at the entry into force of the GATS, the original members, they listed their MFN reservations, and then acceding countries, and upon accession to the WTO, they are also allowed to make reservations to MFN. And this is general obligation to transparency about publication, notification, inquiry point, that I'm going to skip. You can read it by yourself. In the interest of time, I'm not going to the detail of, and you are going to have a separate presentation on domestic regulation. So I'm not going to explain the important obligation on domestic regulation, but I think my colleague will cover that later. What I'm going to talk about now in detail is the schedule of specific commitments. I just mentioned that specific commitments, they are member-specific obligations under the GATS, okay? And each member has the obligation to set out in the schedule their commitments. And each member makes commitments in, you know, on market access, which is usually about quantitative restrictions. And then they make commitments on national treatment. That's about discriminatory measures. And then members, they can also undertake additional commitments about measures which are not about either market access or national treatment. They may be about competition policy and law. They may about domestic regulation. They may about transparency. Okay, so this, I think, additional commitments we are going to show you. I'm going to show you some examples. Okay, so just to repeat again the rationale for specific commitments, the GATS makes a distinction between unnecessary trade barriers and the necessary domestic regulation. So trade barriers are considered as measures which do not make economic sense. Okay, so governments, they don't need to pursue these kind of measures in order to expand the trade, in order to develop services. So this is the rationale behind it. And so quantitative restrictions are considered as the restrictions on market access. And then discriminatory measures, that means discrimination against the foreign services and service suppliers, they are restrictions on national treatment. These two types of restrictions are considered as trade barriers. I already mentioned that they are sort of intended to be eliminated through scheduling, through negotiation. And then there are also regulations. They are non-discriminatory. They are qualitative requirements, like licensing requirements, qualification requirements, technical standards. And this kind of regulations, they are needed. I already mentioned for regulatory purposes, like to ensure the service suppliers, they have the qualification to supply services and then to protect the consumer and to ensure the quality of services. So we make that distinction, and the members, they only schedule restrictions on market access and the national treatment as trade barriers in the schedule. Okay, of course, they additional commitments are optional. Okay. So Article 16, market access. Okay, and there are two provisions. The first provision is to require that your commitments, they are the minimum treatment. Okay, and then you are free to provide more favorable treatment to all the WTO members on MFN basis, but you cannot, okay, provide treatment less favorable than the terms, limitations, conditions in your schedule. So the commitments in your schedule, they are minimum treatment. This is just to let you know that this is important. We call it is minimum treatment obligation. And then in sectors where market access commitments are undertaken, the measures which a member shall not maintain or adopt, either on the basis of a regional subdivision or on the basis of its entire territory, unless otherwise specified in the schedule, are defined. The 6 types of limitations. So limitations on the total number of service suppliers, like monopoly, limitations on the total value of services transaction and assets. Okay, for example, some countries in their financial sector, they restrict the assets owned by foreign banks to maximum 25%, for example. Limitations on the total number of services operations or on the total quantity of services output. Some countries, they restrict the broadcast time of foreign TV programs, for example, and they restrict the business scope of foreign banks. These are all limitations on the total number of service operations, and all limitations on the total number of employees. For example, in foreign invested enterprises can only hire maximum 25% of foreign employees. Or they will say, okay, at least 90% of the employee must be local people. And then there are measures restrict or require specific type of legal entity or joint venture. For example, in financial services and commercial presence of foreign banks must be subsidiary, cannot be branch. And then also joint venture is required if foreign investors, they want to establish affiliate in the country. And then limitations on the participation of foreign capital. This limitation on foreign investment, for example, 49%, okay? So these are all the limitations on market access. National treatment, I don't want to talk too much, is to make sure that foreign services and the service suppliers, they have equal competitive opportunities with local or domestic services suppliers. Okay, this is just to your measures cannot modify the conditions of competition in favor of domestic services and service suppliers. Okay, and for example, some countries, they have discriminatory subsidies or other fiscal measures in favor of domestic. And then in some services sectors, there are nationality requirements. For example, only nationals can do custom clearance services, for example. And then, so for example, in some countries, they require national flag ships can only hire national seafarers, for example. And then in some services, only residents, for example, in insurance services, only residents can provide insurance brokerage services. And also there are some other discriminatory licensing, registration, qualification, training requirements. And also in some sectors, foreign investment is contingent upon transfer of technology, okay? And also foreign services suppliers are not allowed to own land. And also in some cases, foreign investors are required to purchase services provided by domestic services service suppliers. So these are all some typical limitations on national treatment. And additional commitments, I already mentioned that they are measures not about national treatment, not about market access, but they are related to other measures. And then members, they are, if they wish, they can also make additional commitments. This is how it looks like, a schedule under the GATS. So these are 4 columns, okay? Members, they specified access conditions guaranteed for designated sectors and modes of supply, okay? And so the GATS has a very special scheduling approach, and this approach now has been used by a lot of regional trade agreements. So it's called a positive listing approach or the GATS approach. A member lists services sectors and limitations on market access and national treatment a member intends to maintain in the sector. So why we call it a positive listing approach or GATS approach is because only the sectors listed in the schedule, a member has commitments on market access and national treatment. Okay, so if a sector is listed in the schedule, the member inscribe the limitations on market access and limitations on national treatment that the member intends to maintain. And then for limitations and for restrictions are not listed in the schedule, it means that the member has committed not to maintain those limitations. Okay, so this is the scheduling approach under the GATS. Because it's very important, I want to repeat. Okay, I'm going to show you some examples. The commitments, okay, I want to show you. The commitments, okay, they are result of negotiation and they are subject to further negotiation, okay. And then they are the minimum treatments guaranteed by the scheduling member, okay. And then a member only has obligations on market access and national treatment in the sectors listed in the schedule. And the level of commitments is determined by the limitations listed in the column on market access and the column on national treatment. Okay, and the member may negotiate also conditional commitment, additional commitments. They are not about access, they are not about national treatment. And then this is the member specific commitments, and this reflects the flexibility of the GATS. The scheduling approach is very important. It follows some principles. Each member, I think, it should clearly define the sectoral scope of commitments, because schedules require the greatest possible degree of clarity. And then I'm going to explain why. And also, when the member inscribe the limitations, it also needs to be very specific and concise, indicating the elements inconsistent with Article 16 and 17. And then the commitments, they are sort of minimum treatment guaranteed by the government. They reflect your policy considerations. If the intention is to bind the regulatory status quo, the applied regime, your commitments should correspond with your relevant regulation. If the commitments intends to open the market to pursue a future liberalization, of course, your commitments can be more liberal than your applied regime. But in that situation, you need to make a reform, change your regulation, because your regulations must be consistent with your commitments. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the classification. Members, they make commitments, okay? They list the sectors. Most members, they use the GATS classification. This is a classification, sectoral classification list developed in 1991. The document symbol is W120. It is based on UN Provisional Central Classification. And this is used by most WTO members. W120 classifies services into 12 big categories. And under each category, there are subsectors and subsectors. And give you one example. This is a decimal system. Once you have the big category, under each category you have subsector. And then the subsectors, they are connotated with CPC references. And then, so for example, for hotel and the restaurant services, if you want to know how to describe, how to define hotel and restaurant services, you can check CPC. And then if you look at CPC 641, 643, and then you will find out what it means, okay, by hotel services, restaurant services. The same for travel agency services, tour operator services. And then you have 4 digits definition, and tourist guide services, 4 digits definition. Because this classification was developed in 1991, and then more than 2 decades have passed, and this classification is facing challenge, okay? And technology is advanced. Industry also adopt a new business model. So that's what we say, due to technological and industry advances, new commercial terminology and the business models. And then so they use new terms. Services, many services are not explicitly referred to W120. For example, the services like Airbnb, Uber services, like Facebook, and the search engine, social media services, like search engine, Google, And then also like services like, users, they publish their own video like TikTok, like YouTube, okay? All these services you cannot find in the existing classification. And then the question is raised, how we classify all these new type of services, especially services, delivered, digitally delivered, and whether we can read all these services into existing services classification. If so, how? What should be the criteria? And also, there are also some services now, because of digital technology, services they are supplied in a bundle and with multiple end uses. And then, so for example, there are some applications. The applications can allow you to, with multiple functions, okay? And then so the question is raised when you have a bundled services with multiple end uses, and how to classify all these services. And so overall, the question is that the existing classification is inadequate to capture new market reality. How to overcome this problem? I cannot provide answers to all these questions. I may have my personal views on these questions, but members, WTO members, they discussed all these issues, I would say 10 years ago, or less than 10 years, from 2000, I think 2010 to 2014 in the Committee of Specific Commitments. But then there's no conclusion. There's no conclusion. And then, I feel that it's a problem that I also feel that it's a pity that members, they did not continue with that discussion. But this problem can be overcome, but can only be overcome through member discussion. Okay. So, for example, if you ask my personal view, okay, I would say, okay, let's look at the nature of each classification. And for example, W120 and the CPC, this is the nature of the classification. We say is we look at the nature of the products. So again, we look at the nature of Uber, for example. What's the nature of Uber? Uber is a service, it's a platform, it's an application to facilitate. It's similar. It's not. It's related to transport, like taxi, but it's not transport itself. It's an application to facilitate consumer to use transport service. So it's an intermediary service, but it's related to transport. So I would argue that Uber still is a service, is a transport, is a supporting transport supporting service. So this is my personal view. And Airbnb, again, is a platform, is an intermediary platform, and it connects consumer with the landlord. Okay, so it's an intermediary platform, and it's a supporting. It's not hotel services, but it's a supporting to accommodation service. Okay, so just to let you know that we can have this kind of discussion about how to classify this kind of services which are not explicitly referred to in existing classification, but members so far, they haven't had any such discussion yet. Okay, so let's see in the future whether members, they want to have this kind of discussion. The reason why members, they don't have this kind of discussion about classification because there's no negotiation. And then members, they don't feel that there's a need to have this kind of discussion. Okay, there's a common, some common scheduling terminology. When we say, you know, there's a level of commitments, we use the term none to say no limitation. That's 4 commitments are marked or national treatment. And then we use the term unbound to mean that no commitments, that members reserve the right to adopt measures inconsistent with market and national treatment. And then in between, you have specific commitments, that's measures specified. So let's look at one example. For example, here, you have hotel and restaurant services. And so this member has made a commitment on hotel restaurant services based on CPC with the reference to CPC code. And for mode 1, it's unbound with asterisk because due to lack of technical feasibility, because hotel restaurant services requires the physical contact between consumers and service producers. So you cannot supply hotel and restaurant services through mode 1 cross-border, so it's unbound. And mode 2, there's no limitation, so it's none. So governments normally, they don't restrict their own people travel to another country to consume services. And this member has made a commitment on the mode 3. And then there's only one limitation on market size. There are the limitation, it says the admission of new hotels in individual provinces may be made contingent on past tourist arrival over a representative period. This is a type of limitation, we call it economic needs test. So it's not with an absolute specific number, the limitation, but it's still quantitative. The nature is still quantitative because it still restricted the total number of hotels in the country. So it says, okay, whether I give a license to new hotel, I will look at the arrival of tourists in the past few years. And then so that's what we need. We will look at whether we have economic needs to establish new hotels. So it's still a quantitative restriction on market access in the hotel area. This is very important. You see, there's only one limitation here. That means that this member has no limitation on other market access. And then for mode 3, national treatment, there's one limitation. Foreign-owned hotels and the restaurants are subject to training requirements. 1 trainee per 2 regular staff. So basically, it's require foreign investors to provide the training to local staff. Okay. And for mode 4, it's non-unbound. Unbound, that means that no commitments. Okay. So there are overlap between market size and the national treatment. So members normally, they don't repeat, and then they only list that limitation in market size, but it applies to both market size and the national treatment. Look at here one example. Here the services concerned is voice telephone services in telecommunication. And for mode 1 and mode 2, none, that means that no limitation at all. So that means for international voice telephone services, incoming and outgoing, there's no limitation. And this member for mode 3, market says this member has made commitments only one on market access, none except direct investment by foreign persons in the service supplier cannot exceed 20%. So the only limitation on market access is limitation on foreign investment. It's an investment ceiling. And then another limitation on national treatment. The chairman and the majority of board and director shall be nationals. So this member has listed one limitation on market access, but there are two limitations on national treatment. One is in the sector on national treatment, another one is in market access, because this measure on foreign investment is both quantitative and discriminatory. But according to our scheduling code, you only need to schedule once. You don't need to repeat, okay? And then this member has made additional commitments, undertakes the obligations contained in the attached reference paper. So this is a document negotiated by a group of members in the negotiations on telecommunications. And this document is called the reference paper. In that document, you will find some disciplines on competition in telecommunications, like independence of regulator, like the disciplines on interconnection between operators, like some disciplines on major service suppliers, and all these disciplines, okay, the reference paper itself is not legally binding, but as long as a member is attached to the schedule, it becomes part of the schedule, part of the commitment, and it becomes binding. Okay, now I see a question from Sam. Okay, Sam, you have the floor, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, please.
Okay, Raj, thank you so much for the presentation. Slight clarification on this particular side. We know we schedule the commitment on limitation on the foreign service suppliers. I don't know, this is my understanding. So, so if we make a commitment, say the foreign supplier is allowed to have a foreign ownership only up to 20%, it seems that the ownership is still with the local persons. So 80% belongs to the local. I mean, it's a local company. So is this discipline, it's equally applicable in that case as well, if it is the case?
No, here it applies only to foreign, it said foreign persons, okay? So it's about the participation in the enterprises of foreign investment. So it's a limitation on 20%, it applies only to foreign service suppliers. But you raise, I think the question is very, I want to make 2 points on your question. The first I want to make, first point is that here the commitments is only minimum requirement, minimum treatment. So in your market, the government, you are free to provide better treatment. You can allow foreign investment in the service, in the enterprise, like 49% or even 100%. But your commitment, your obligation under the GATT is only 20%. So this is a minimum. So that means that you cannot, require foreign service suppliers to, invest less than 20%, or you cannot prohibit. You cannot prohibit foreign investment in telecommunication, for example, for this case. But you can free to provide better treatment. Okay, this is one point I want to make. Second point, you are right that you can just disregard this one. You can apply this to both domestic and domestic and foreign service suppliers. Okay, and then this is again, that means that you don't have to follow. This is just something you guarantee. Why members they are allowed to do that? Because members they always want to have some leverage in negotiation. They want to have some flexibility. So this is something that is minimum. And actually in practice, in the real world, most WTO members, their applied regime, their regulations are much better, much more favorable than their commitments. So this raises a serious problem under the GATS, that the commitments, they don't they don't provide what we say, the transparency, and then also the binding is not enough, because members, they can always take back their liberalization measures because without violating their commitments. So this is, you raise very good question. Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you.
Okay, now this is horizontal commitments. Each schedule has two parts. The first one is horizontal, second one is sectoral. Horizontal, why we need horizontal is very simple, because there are some measures like investment measures, they apply to all the sectors, and then in order to avoid repetition, and the members, they just list at the very beginning. This is the same for Sri Lanka, your schedule. Your investment measures, they are listed in the horizontal section at the very beginning of the schedule, okay? And then so the horizontal commitments, they apply to all the sectors in the schedule. So when you read the schedule, you should read the sectoral commitments in conjunction with the horizontal commitments, okay? So let's look at the one example. This example is that, this is a commitment made by European Union. European Union has made a reservation on public utilities. It says services considered as public utilities at the national or local level may be subject to public monopolies or exclusive rights granted to private sector. And then public utilities exist in a number of sectors like R&D, like social services, technical testing, like health services, transport services. And so if for example, if a member has made if you look at the sectoral commitments, it doesn't mention monopoly. But in practice, there's a monopoly. You can challenge it. You cannot challenge that because there's a sweeping reservation at the very beginning. Okay, so you have to read sectoral commitments in conjunction with horizontal commitments. Okay, another example here, for example, a member has made unbound for subsidies, unbound for acquisition of land subject to government approval. So for all the sectors listed in the schedule, the government can provide discriminatory subsidies. That means that you only reserve your subsidies to domestic service suppliers without extending to foreign services suppliers. But then in that case, because you have unbound, that means that you have made a reservation on subsidies, so you will not be challenged. You have no obligation on subsidies in terms of national treatment. And under Mode 4, that is the commitment, the pattern of commitments. Most members, they have made commitments on Mode 4 in this way, unbound, except for the temporary presence for up to 3 years of the following category of persons: services salespersons, intercorporate transferees, executive managers, specialists, professionals, personnel engaged in establishment. You see, members normally they are willing to make commitments on Mode 4 related to Mode 3. So if a member has made commitments on Mode 3, allowing foreign investors to establish in the country, they will allow also foreign investors to bring in some senior staff, like executives or managers. And then this is in most situations. So it's mode 4 commitments related or linked to mode 3. Okay. Very briefly, members, whether members they can modify their schedules, the answer is yes, but the modification of a GET schedule has to follow procedures. And if you look at the legal basis, it's Article 21. Members, they can modify their schedule, but we have 2 sets of instruments providing for procedures. So if you modify your schedule, okay, the modification is to withdraw your existing commitments, or you reduce your scope of your commitments, okay? You make your existing commitments more restrictive, less liberal, then you will have to follow a set of procedure in document SL80. And this procedure says that, you notify your intention of modification, and then other members will have 45 days to claim their interest. Once other members have made their claim of interest, and then you will have to negotiate with all these claimed affected members to negotiate compensation. And once you reach a conclusion or agreement on the compensation, and you can certify your modification. Otherwise, you cannot modify your schedule if there's no agreement on the compensation. And the objecting member, they also can raise arbitration. Okay, so this is the modification of the schedule. The procedure is contained in SL80. I make it very brief. If you have questions, you can just let me, we can raise that later. This is a very burdensome procedure because you have to renegotiate your commitments if you want to withdraw your existing commitments. But we have another set of procedures. It's more simplified. It's a procedure for improvement. If you want to make new commitments, improve your existing commitments, and or if you find some technical errors in your existing commitments, you want to correct them, and you can follow this simplified procedure contained in SL84. And again, you notify your intention to make improvements or intention to make technical corrections. And the other members, they will have 45 days to raise objection. And the objection by other members has also to specify the reason for objection. Normally, they will have to say, okay, the modification, intended modifications, they are not new commitments, they reduce the scope of commitments, scope of existing commitments. And after the 45 days, if there's no objection, you can go ahead to certify your improvement. But if there are objections, and then of course the member has to enter into consultation with the objecting member. And then there's a loophole in the procedure, because if members, they cannot reach any agreement about at the end of consultation, and then the objecting member refuses to withdraw the objection, and then the process may be stuck. So that's a problem. And in the past, members discussed the procedures, but they didn't discuss how to improve all these procedures. Let's see in the future whether members, they can work on the procedures and improve the procedures in the future. Okay. So I think I have some time. I want to discuss a little bit the commitments of Sri Lanka, and then I'm going to have some questions. Okay. Sri Lanka is an original WTO member. And also Sri Lanka, after the entry into force of the GATS, after the establishment of WTO, Sri Lanka also participated into the extended negotiation on financial services and on telecommunication. And then so Sri Lanka has made commitments on telecommunication and financial services. So original schedule contains only one sector, tourism, but the supplementary schedules contains commitments on telecommunication and financial services. If we look at the subsectors, Sri Lanka's schedule covers 24 subsectors out of 160 sectors. 160 subsectors, that's the subsectors in W120. So Sri Lanka has made commitments on 24 subsectors. And this means that Sri Lanka has no commitments in most service sectors. When we say no commitments, that means that under the GATS, Sri Lanka still has the freedom to adopt or maintain limitations on market access and national treatment in most service sectors. Okay, Sri Lanka has only bindings on telecommunication, financial services, and tourism. And it is very interesting. Sri Lanka's commitments are not, you have followed the classification W120, but Sri Lanka has no commitments, has not used CPC reference in the schedule. And horizontal commitments in Sri Lanka's schedule are mainly about, like most WTO members, about the restrictions on foreign investment, Mode 3, and also restrictions on Mode 4. And Sri Lanka's commitments on telecommunications, my understanding is that the applied regime is much more liberal than commitments. And Sri Lanka has made additional commitments based on reference paper. What is very interesting is that Sri Lanka has made very extensive commitments on financial services. My understanding is that financial service, Sri Lanka financial services, I think, are probably the most important service sector in Sri Lanka's economy. And maybe that's the reason Sri Lanka has made very important commitments on financial services. Commitments are undertaken in accordance with the GATS, the annex on financial services, but also the understanding on commitments in financial services. This is very special. Why? Because we have an annex on financial services. A lot of members have made commitments based on annex on financial services. The annex provides definition on financial services and also has some rules on domestic regulation. Okay. But there's another document, it's called Understanding on Commitments in Financial Services. Understanding on commitment in financial services is not legally binding. Actually, it's a model schedule for for high level of commitments in financial services, for high level of commitment in financial services, in total in the WTO, I think it's around 34 members, WTO members have made commitments based on the understanding on commitments in financial services, and most of them, they are developed economies, but Sri Lanka as a developing economy has made commitments on understanding on commitments in financial services, and understanding on commitments in financial services is, I mentioned that, you know, allows for high level of commitments in financial service sector, in particular on the mode 1 and a cross-border supply and mode 2. And so this is I think is very interesting, and just to highlight, okay, as an overview of gas commitments by Sri Lanka. Okay, and what I want to show you is that the relationship between commitments and applied regime. I already mentioned that commitments only guarantee minimum treatment, minimum market access and national treatment conditions. And most WTO members, they are trading conditions in services. We call it the applied regime. They are much more liberal than their commitments. The reason for that is because I already mentioned, when WTO members, when they negotiated the GATS back to 1980s, 1990s, the objective is just to reach a multilateral agreement, and then there is no threshold requirement to bind status quo or applied regime at that time. So a lot of members, they just made commitments even more restrictive than their applied regime. And even some members, they did bind their applied regime. Their commitments corresponded to their applied regime at that time in 1990s. Now 20 years have passed. Services trade has evolved enormously, and a lot of countries have implemented liberalization policies. A lot of services sectors in most economies have been liberalized. For example, telecommunication is a case. In the past, telecommunications in most countries are subject to monopoly or duopoly, subject to a lot of quantitative restrictions. And now telecommunications have become a very competitive sector, like in financial services, okay? And then so the question is raised, okay, the market has evolved. Applied regimes have changed, but commitments, they remain the same. The reason, of course, is because we didn't succeed in the DDA negotiation. Although DDA negotiation is not officially concluded, but we all know that it's going nowhere. So this is why we say in the GATS commitments, there exists huge water. Huge water is between commitments and the commitments and the applied regime. And the applied regimes, they are much more liberal than the GATS commitments. And then because of the existence of the huge water, GATS commitments become for business, they are not meaningful. They are not fully meaningless, but they are not meaningful, and also they cannot provide transparency, legal certainty, predictability. So let's look at, for example, the Sri Lanka commitment in telecommunication. International basic voice telephone services. Limitation on market access for mode 1, 2, 3. And Sri Lanka has said monopoly guaranteed for Sri Lanka Telecom SLT until 31st December 1999. Government of Sri Lanka proposes thereafter to issue an additional license, depending mainly on satisfactory progress having been made with respect to tariff rebalancing. So we know that monopoly shall be concluded by the end of 1991. After that, the government will propose some new license. But we don't know whether if you just look at the schedule, we don't know whether there's new license. And also, Sri Lanka is not buying, is not bound by any commitments. And then if you look at other commitments like, domestic, local, and long distance basic mobile cellular services that 4 operators licenses, okay, this number will be reviewed by the government in the year of 2000. So the guaranteed commitments is 4 operators. And the government said, okay, we are going to review that in 2000, but it seems to imply that after the governmental review, there will be new licenses, but there's no commitments. There's no new commitments after the review. And then if you look at satellite-based services, the commitments that issuing of license is under consideration. But still, again, it's under consideration, but there's no commitments to issue license. And then the information, we see the information. If you look at the information, for example, there's no notification from Sri Lanka. The Commission permitted the use of global mobile personal communication services in Sri Lanka with effect from 9 April 1999, subject to issuance of a license on the section. So from the notification, we know that there's a new license issued, at least probably 99, according to the law, okay? But we don't know whether there's any updates after that. And then we know that there's according to the trade policy review, we know that the monopoly of Sri Lanka Telecom over international and voice telephone services ended in 2022. Okay, so we know that monopoly ended, and then telecommunication sector has opened up to several providers in most sectors, including fixed telephone, mobile telephone, satellite telephone, and the market comprises 5 mobile service providers and 3 fixed line operators. Okay, so we know that the applied regime are much more liberal than the commitments. And then, and also Sri Lanka has proceeded with liberalizing many of its telecom sectors, and the applied regime is much more liberal than its GET commitments. But then the applied regime is not reflected in the commitments. So there's a huge gap between the applied regime and the commitments. So what's the consequence? Consequence is that for business, for foreign investors, if they just read the Sri Lanka's GET commitments, the signals from the commitments are very restrictive, are very liberal, are not liberal enough. And then so the commitments cannot tell how many operators are in the market, how many operators are allowed, and what is the business investment environment. So the commitments cannot provide some transparency and the clarity to the business. So this is why that's why we say the gap between commitments and applied regime, or the water in GATS commitments, can affect the foreign investment. And then this is in order to make meaningful commitments. So this is why members are encouraged try to update their commitments. But unfortunately, because negotiations are stalled, commitments, GATS commitment cannot be updated through negotiations. But members are free to improve their commitments at any time. And for example, recently Thailand has made improved commitments in telecommunication, and also certified its improvements to its telecom communication. Okay, I think I am done with my presentation. Now I want to ask whether you have any questions. I'm sorry, in the interest of time, probably some issues I cannot explain in detail, but now I want to answer some questions. The floor is open. Please just raise your hand and like what Sam did, just ask your questions, please.
Rosie, I have already sent you 2 questions, but
oh, okay. I'm sorry. Let me look at the chat box. There are a lot of
I think there are a lot of questions. Anyway, for the benefit of everyone, let me raise them verbally. The first thing, when you were referring to the exceptions, because you said government, always, because they also conduct services, the government, governmental-led service sectors, like you gave the example of the hospitals. So sometimes now the government procurement agreement, that I think mainly relates to trading goods. But do you also have a similar concept in GATS? I think the exceptions are there. The governmental services are not part and parcel of the GATS. So that is the first question. The second question, you were also referring to the modification of schedules as per the Article 21 of the GATS. I think, but in the GATT, it is under Article 28 of the GATT. There, I think, when you need to modify, I'm now referring to GATT schedules. When you want to modify your GATT schedule, that is the tariff schedule, you actually have to follow Article 28 of the GATT, where you first have to negotiate with the countries who are having initial negotiating rights, then the principal supply rights, then the substantial supply rights. So that is in the GATT. But when it comes to GATS, modification of your schedules as per Article 21 of the GATS, do you have similar concepts in prevalence?
Okay, thank you. I will start with you the second question. Yeah, we don't have this initial negotiating rights concept in the GATS, okay? And as long as a member expresses its interest, and as long as a member claims that its interest has been affected by intended modification, the modifying member has the obligation to enter into negotiation with that affecting member. So there's no sort of initial negotiating rights. Okay, so even if you don't need to to prove that you have a right to enter renegotiation. And for example, a few years ago, when European Union sort of enlarged, and there are, European Union enlarged from 15 to 28, 25, and then to 25, and then to 27, 28. And the new European Union EU members, they have to modify their schedules in order to meet the common requirements of the European Union. And then some new members, they are sort of commitments are much more liberal than the common level. So they have to withdraw some of their commitments. And in that situation, European Union, notified their intention to withdraw some commitments. And a lot of members, they claim that their interests might be affected by the intended modification. And then they just claim and say, okay, we want to enter into negotiation because we believe that our interests will be affected. And then the European Union entered into negotiation with 18 members, and they negotiated for several years, and then they reached agreement. But this is only for the EU enlargement to 25 members. And the EU enlargement to 27 or 28 members, negotiations still ongoing and not concluded. So just to answer your question, our process is different from the Article 28 under the GATT, okay? Your second question about government procurement. I don't have time to mention that. We also have a provision under the GATT called government procurement. And this is sort of one part of the building agenda. So far, we haven't, had specific rules on government procurement under the GATT, but members at the end of Europe round, they agreed to continue the negotiation. And before having any specific rules on government procurement, the three main provisions, three main articles, they do not apply to government procurement, MFN, market access, and the national treatment. So the GATT commitments do not, members, they don't need to make commitments on government procurement in GATT schedule. Okay, so because market access, national treatment, and MFN, they do not apply. Okay, and then another question is that some services, okay, whether they are whether they are subject to government procurement or not, this is a tricky question. Okay, we have a definition. What it means under the GATT, it says that procurement services, they are sort of by government agencies. The services purchased by government agencies for governmental purposes and not with a view to commercial resale. Okay, and so this is very clear. In order to be covered by government procurement under the GATT, okay, the services, they are purchased by government agency for governmental purposes and not subject to commercial resale. I hope I answer your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Rosie, because I asked about the modification of schedules under Article 21 of the GATT, because that also has I'm now relating to my comment on the ongoing negotiations under the joint initiative on domestic regulation.
Yes.
And we are aware now, I think the news goes around in the WTO quarters that the proponents are going to use Article 21 of the GATT, that is the modification of schedules, in order to bring their outcomes that they have been negotiating under the DSR, Domestic Service Regulation on JSI. So that is a very important aspect. I think Sri Lanka should be mindful of it, because Sri Lanka is not a proponent of the JSI DSR, Joint Initiative on Domestic Service Regulation. So, that means, yeah,
sorry,
I think it is something.
I think I just mentioned this is schedule. It's modification that's SL80. The domestic regulation JSI participants, they are going to use another set of procedure that's SL84. So it's not the procedure sort of to withdraw commitments is for certification SL84. That's a little bit different. It's
Yeah,
they will
I
they
know,
will
I know
not
yeah, it is a different, but we also worry that they'll be using the other mechanism, because they are looking at both aspects. But anyway, it's too early to really comment on it. But the rumor goes around that they'll also be using Article 21 and the domestic regulation, the certification procedure as well. Now, coming to our commitments, particularly in the financial sector, financial service sector.
Yes.
I think you said that our commitments, particularly in mode 1 and mode 2, but not in mode 3 and mode 4. The thing is, this particular flexibility was very useful for Sri Lanka to defend its measures that Sri Lanka had undertaken due to the balance of payment crisis. I think because, as many alluded, that Sri Lanka had been, of course, been asked to withdraw these measures. I think the measures, the restriction was imposed on the banking sector, the provision of financing for the letter of credit and other payment terms by the banks, the commercial banks, which was levied across the board on all local banks as well as foreign banks. So I think because though we have made commitments, but all these commitments are subject to the general conditions that are in the, it means the laws and regulations. So if the law requires banks not to release foreign exchange for the purpose of servicing the transactions, the commercial transactions, I think that is where we use that flexibility, because we modified the law that are affecting the financial services. That is the provision of commercial foreign exchange for commercial transactions. So I think it was seen as a very flexible approach, because Sri Lanka had not made drastic commitments. They are very flexible kind of, and we had a lot of flexibility and space when Sri Lanka incorporated into it GATS schedule of specific commitments with respect to mode 3 and both and also market access and national treatment. So that is the particularly in the banking services. So that paved the way for Sri Lanka to modify its laws, and so that still prove that we are within our GATS commitments. Of course, there are other issues as well, because since the banking services also affecting provision of goods, because it's also impacting on how much you can import, but the measure at the very initial kind of analysis, it fall on the GATS rather than the GATT. That was something that we realized Sri Lanka was very wise enough to make such a flexible and very liberal, flexible and kind of commitments, so that that flexibility was very important for a country like us at the time of facing balance of payment crisis. Thank you.
I agree. I thank you very much for your comments on financial services. I focus on telecommunication, but I think you complement that very well. And then so now I have some questions in the box. There's one about how about the COVID pandemic impacted provision and services and negotiation. How do developing countries, particularly small economies, ensure their interests are reflected? How can WTO negotiations keep up with RTA service negotiations? These are all big questions. I very briefly, the COVID pandemic has impacted services more than trading goods. reason I already mentioned, because of the quarantine, the restrictions on travel, and then so and especially developing countries, small economies. You all remember last year that, for example, in maritime transport, freight rates rocketed, very high, and then small economies, especially economies like Sri Lanka, relying on maritime international shipping, and affected. So this is just one example. And but then how do developing countries, small economy, ensure their interests are reflected? I would argue that developing economies, small economies, make the best use of multilateral trading system, and try to negotiate, and also make their voice heard at WTO bodies, raise trade concerns. Okay, and then so I think this is because, for example, small economies, their interests are affected during the pandemic. But in services bodies, we haven't heard not much concerns raised by small economies. And so I think this developing economies, small economies, should make the best of the multilateral trading system. How can WTO negotiation keep up with RTA service negotiations? Again, this is member-driven economy, member-driven organization, and then this really depends on members, their motivation to use this organization. And I think does WTO provide technical support for members to undertake economic needs tests in various sectors? We provide technical assistance on the GATS, and then we sometimes talk about technical needs test, but there's no sort of technical support for members to undertake economic needs tests in various sectors. That we didn't do. Okay. So maybe in the future we should consider that. Yeah. Okay, I think I covered all the questions. If there's no other questions, and I want to thank you all for your interest, for your participation, and especially I want to thank you, Miss Ambassador Silva, and then for your insightful comments, and okay, and welcome. I want to stay in touch with all of you. If you have any questions, and if there are some points I haven't explained in detail, if we please just reach out to me without hesitation. I will definitely answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosie. Then we'll be meeting again on the next day. Jai Kodi, when do we again have the session?
And the next session.
Madam, we are having the next session on 20th. But there is something to be informed to all participants, because we had to change the timing of the program, and we will be starting the program at 1 o'clock Geneva time. Then Sri Lanka time would be 8:30.
Right. So then, till then, the delegates will be, sorry, not delegates, the participants will be having the slides. Rosie, would you be able to circulate them to
Yes.
the participants as early as possible, so that they'll be able to read, go through all your slides and maybe the recording as well, so that when they come next, maybe they'll be having more questions. So we'll encourage them to have more questions, because this session should be interactive as much as we can. Otherwise, the speaker gets very bored, I think. So in fairness to the speakers, I think WTO staff, because they are really devoting their time, very valuable time with us. So it would be a kind of a fair request also from the Secretariat. So to have more questions posed to them, they'll be very pleased to provide responses to those as much as they can. Isn't that, Rosie? Because it's the way that we should be having. It's like a, forget about that we are in a virtual mode. I think we always have the benefit of having physical presence, but due to the restrictions, I think we are still have to really live up with this virtual format for the time being. But I think it would be useful to have questions as much as we can accommodate.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
have a good evening to our colleagues in Sri Lanka. And also thank you, Rosie. Good afternoon. And thank you so much for your very enriching, comprehensive presentation. And we understand it's really not easy. As I told you, as I told participants in the beginning, this is a complex agreement, but user-friendly. I think, as she said, it's a flexible agreement. I think one of the most flexible agreements that we can see. And you undertake commitments only if it is necessary and based on your level of development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Yeah. The slides will be circulated immediately.